All right, welcome to the deep dive. You give us the material and we'll unpack it and give you those gold nuggets of knowledge.
Just for you, the learner.
Exactly. Today we're taking a deep dive into Brené Brown's Daring Greatly, how the courage to be vulnerable transforms the way we live, love, parent, and lead.
A pretty ambitious title.
It is, right. But her work has had a huge impact on so many people. I mean, it's all centered on this idea of vulnerability.
And how it really impacts every single part of our lives. Our relationships, how we raise our kids, even how we show up as leaders.
Exactly. So let's dive in and see how Brené Brown breaks it all down.
Sounds good.
So right off the bat, Brain starts with a story that I think a lot of us can relate to. She's in therapy, talking to her therapist, Diana, and she just blurts out, "I frickin' hate vulnerability."
Talk about getting straight to the point.
No kidding, right. But she goes on to explain why she feels so strongly about it.
Yeah, vulnerability was, for her, all about uncertainty, about stepping into the unknown. It was about the potential for getting hurt, for being disappointed.
Things she described as excruciating, not just unpleasant, but intensely painful.
Exactly. And that's where we see this really interesting contrast with how Diana viewed vulnerability.
Right. Diana calls it an exquisite emotion. And apparently she even smiled when she said it, like she was picturing something beautiful. Brown's reaction, well, let's just say she was a bit taken aback.
It's a pretty stark difference in perspective, Eric. But then Brown admits something really interesting. The only reason she was even exploring this whole vulnerability thing was because her research kept pointing to it as essential for what she calls a wholehearted life.
So it wasn't just an intellectual exercise for her, it was personal.
Exactly. And she goes on to describe what feeling vulnerable actually feels like for her. It's not just an abstract concept, it's a physical sensation. She says it felt like coming out of my skin, this really intense feeling of being exposed.
I can definitely relate to that. And then, of course, comes that natural urge to try and fix whatever is making you feel that way.
To regain some sense of control.
Exactly. And when she can't fix it, she says she doesn't actually punch anyone in the face. Instead, she defaults to these other behaviors.
Like suddenly needing to clean, or reaching for comfort food, peanut butter in her case, or blaming, trying to control the uncontrollable, even making her surroundings perfect.
It's like that instinct to create order when everything feels chaotic.
Definitely. Now think about the things that trigger these feelings of vulnerability for her. They're so relatable, right? Fear, anxiety, uncertainty.
Yeah, those make sense. But it's also things like having to have tough conversations or trying new things, putting yourself out there and facing potential criticism.
What about worrying about the people you love? Feeling helpless when they're going through something?
Ugh, that one gets me every time. And even those moments when things feel almost too good or maybe too scary, she says that can trigger that same vulnerable feeling.
Like we're bracing ourselves for the other shoe to drop.
Exactly. And Brown connects all of this to this really powerful idea of stepping into the arena, whether that's a new relationship, a big meeting, a creative project, a difficult family conversation.
It's about having the courage to show up and let yourself be seen, knowing there's a risk of getting hurt.
That's what she calls daring greatly.
Now, before she really embraced this concept of daring greatly, Brown had her own ways of coping with these uncomfortable feelings of vulnerability.
She talks about wearing different suits of armor, basically strategies to keep people at a distance.
Always having an exit strategy.
Yeah, trying to control the uncontrollable.
But she also recognizes that she had this huge heart and ready empathy.
This natural pull towards connection, even when she was scared.
Exactly. And her career path really reflects this inner conflict. She goes from management at AT&T to the world of social work.
That's quite a leap. What prompted that?
Well, her initial motivation, she says, was to fix people and systems. It's a common thread for a lot of people drawn to that field.
That desire to alleviate suffering. So after all this personal exploration and years of research, what did she learn about people who really do live this wholehearted life?
She identified 5 key things that set them apart. The first one is what she calls radical authenticity.
So not trying to be who you think you should be.
Exactly. It's about embracing your true self, flaws and all.
That takes a lot of courage. What's the next one?
Self-compassion, letting go of that harsh inner critic and treating yourself with kindness and understanding.
We can be so much harder on ourselves than we are on anyone else.
So true. The third one is cultivating a resilient spirit, letting go of numbing and powerlessness and finding strength in spirituality and hope.
Numbing is definitely something we need to unpack a bit more. What about the fourth guidepost?
Gratitude and joy. It's about letting go of that scarcity mindset, that feeling that there's never enough, and actively choosing to cultivate joy and appreciation for what you have.
Focus on the good, not just the bad. And the fifth?
Intuition and trusting faith. Letting go of the need for absolute certainty and embracing trust in yourself and something bigger than yourself.
So these five guideposts paint a picture of someone who's living with a real sense of inner peace and connection. But how do they actually get there?
Brown makes it clear that a strong sense of worthiness isn't something you're just born with. It's something you cultivate through your choices, through your daily practices.
It's a journey, not a destination. And what's the main thing these wholehearted people are striving for?
Their focus isn't on achieving some external measure of success or trying to be perfect. They're more focused on living a life defined by courage, compassion, and connection.
And here's where it gets really interesting because Brown found that these wholehearted people weren't trying to avoid vulnerability, they saw it as essential.
Exactly. They identified it as the very thing that fuels courage, compassion, and connection. Not something to fear, but something to embrace.
And this wasn't just a minor observation. The willingness to be vulnerable was the single most important value shared by all of the people she identified as living wholeheartedly.
It was the key differentiator. And what's even more compelling is that they attributed their successes in all areas of their lives to this ability to be vulnerable.
So Brown's research was really clear about the importance of vulnerability. But then comes this big turning point for her personally, the Ted Houston talk.
Yes, back in June 2010, she was invited to speak at this independently organized TED event. And, TED is all about spreading ideas worth spreading, bringing together fascinating people with powerful messages.
And the Ted Houston organizers seem to have given her a lot of freedom.
They did. Instead of shying away from a researcher who studies shame and vulnerability, they basically said to her, "We love what you do. Just talk about what makes you come alive. Be yourself."
Talk about a vote of confidence.
Right. But I can imagine it was both incredibly freeing and terrifying for her.
Totally. I mean, she loved the freedom, but also felt completely exposed by it. It was vulnerability all over again. She even admits that leading up to the talk, she wasn't even sure what her core message was going to be.
But she obviously found it because her talk on vulnerability ended up going viral after it was featured on the main TED website.
That must have been an incredible feeling, and also maybe a little overwhelming.
It was. On the one hand, it was an amazing opportunity to reach a much wider audience. But on the other hand, her initial reaction was pure terror. She was used to the idea of maybe 500 people in a live audience. Now it was millions of people online, and the potential for criticism was exponentially higher.
It's fascinating how even success can come with its own unique set of vulnerabilities and fears.
It definitely can. Now, Brown also talks about this pervasive, never enough culture that so many of us feel trapped in. How does that tie into vulnerability?
Well, she observed that after years of research, the common thread running through so many of our struggles is this feeling of being sick of feeling afraid.
We want to dare greatly, but we're bombarded with messages that tell us to be afraid, to blame.
Right. And it's in this context that she mentions this pretty blunt Texan expression, you can't swing a cat without hitting a narcissist.
She admits it wasn't her most eloquent moment, but it stemmed from this frustration with how casually and often incorrectly the term narcissism was being thrown around.
Like, it's become this catch-all term for any behavior we don't like.
Exactly. But Brown digs deeper into what's actually underneath those narcissistic tendencies.
And she makes this important connection between narcissism and shame, right?
Yes. While we often associate narcissism with grandiosity, the need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, Brown argues that shame is actually at the core of it all.
So our natural inclination to try to fix narcissistic behavior by shaming people, that's probably not going to work.
Probably not.
Oh.
Because shame is often the cause of those behaviors, not the cure.
That makes a lot of sense. This then leads into her discussion of the cultural messages that fuel this feeling of not enough, this constant sense of inadequacy. What are some of the key messages that contribute to this?
One of the most pervasive is this idea that an ordinary life is somehow meaningless. We're constantly bombarded with media and narratives that celebrate the extraordinary, the exceptional.
And she also talks about the impact of reality TV, celebrity culture, and especially unsupervised social media.
Yes, especially for younger generations, social media can create a completely distorted view of reality where self-worth is tied to likes and follower counts. It's a breeding ground for comparison and the feeling of always falling short.
It shifts our focus from internal validation to external validation.
Exactly. And Brown makes it clear that she sees this struggle with not enough as a universal vulnerability. It's not about us versus them.
We all have that need to feel like our lives matter.
We do. And she understands that pull to use things like grandiosity and the constant seeking of admiration as a way to soothe that ache of feeling inadequate.
Even though those very behaviors end up creating more pain and disconnection.
Exactly. Now, even in cases where a formal diagnosis is needed, Brown argues that looking at these struggles through the lens of vulnerability can be really helpful.
How so?
It allows us to ask some really important questions. What are the cultural messages that are shaping our behavior? How are our struggles actually attempts to protect ourselves? And how are our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors connected to our vulnerability and our need for worthiness?
Those are some really insightful questions. They help us move beyond judgment and towards understanding.
Exactly. Now, to really understand vulnerability, we need to debunk some of the myths surrounding it. One of the biggest is that vulnerability equals weakness.
That's a really common misconception, isn't it?
It is, and Brown directly addresses it. She acknowledges that vulnerability involves exposure, uncertainty, and emotional risk. But she argues that taking those risks and opening yourself up emotionally doesn't make you weak. In fact, it often takes a lot of courage.
She shares a great example from her research to illustrate this.
Yes. One participant realized that their attempts to be invulnerable after a painful experience had actually prevented them from receiving the genuine protection and support they needed.
By shutting down vulnerability, they shut down connection.
Exactly. Now, even someone who studies vulnerability, like Brown, can still experience fear and anxiety around it. She talks about her experience speaking at the main TED conference in Long Beach.
I can only imagine how nerve-wracking that must have been.
It was a big deal for her. Not only was it a film talk in front of a very successful audience, but she was also the closing speaker for the entire event.
The pressure must have been immense.
It was. She realized she couldn't just copy what other speakers had done. She had to connect with the audience authentically, and that meant being vulnerable.
Stepping outside of her comfort zone.
Yes, she had to move away from her script and actually look people in the eye.
Mm.
She describes that feeling as being completely naked.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
And she even shares that she has recurring nightmares about literally being naked in public. It really highlights that deep-seated fear of being truly seen and exposed.
So what did she do?
Well, when she walked onto that stage, the first thing she did was make eye contact with people in the audience and ask for the house lights to be raised so she could see them.
To make that human connection.
Exactly. And during her talk, she asked the audience two specific questions that revealed some really interesting things about vulnerability. She also reflects on how she used to respond to feeling vulnerable before she started her research.
And those pre-research responses were pretty consistent across the board, right?
They were. Whether it was in her personal life or her work, her go-to reactions were fear, anger, judgment, the need to control, and this desperate attempt to manufacture certainty.
All ways of avoiding or managing that feeling of vulnerability.
Exactly. And it highlights her point that whether we like it or not, vulnerability does us. We can't escape it. It's an inherent part of the human experience.
And pretending to be invulnerable often leads us to behave in ways that don't align with who we want to be.
It does. The choice we have isn't whether or not we experience vulnerability, but how we respond to it.
It's like that Rush quote, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice.
Exactly. So how does Brown actually define vulnerability? What does she mean by that word?
Her concise definition is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's about stepping outside your comfort zone, not knowing the outcome, and allowing yourself to be seen emotionally.
And it's important to be clear about what it's not. It's not weakness, it's not being a pushover, and it's not just indiscriminate oversharing.
There's a real element of discernment involved, so it's not just about spilling your guts to anyone who will listen.
No, not at all. True vulnerability, according to Brown, is about sharing your feelings and experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them.
People you trust.
Exactly. It's about appropriate and reciprocal sharing, not about desperation or attention seeking.
So how does trust factor into all of this?
Well, she uses this really great analogy to explain how trust is built in relationships. The marble jar.
I love that analogy.
It's such a good one. It illustrates that trust is built gradually through small, everyday moments of connection.
Not grand gestures, but those little acts of kindness and reliability.
Exactly. Each one is like adding another marble to the jar. She even talks about Dr. John Gottman's research on couples and these sliding door moments where we have a choice to connect with our partner or turn away.
Those moments where trust is either built or eroded.
Exactly. Now, on the flip side, what are some of the things that erode trust in our relationships?
I'm guessing it's not just the big, obvious betrayals.
You're right. Brown expands the definition of betrayal to include something she calls disengagement.
What does that mean exactly?
It's about a withdrawal of care, a letting go of the connection. It's about no longer being willing to invest time and effort in the relationship.
That slow fade can be really painful.
It can. And Brown argues that disengagement is actually the most common and potentially the most dangerous form of betrayal when it comes to trust.
So, embracing vulnerability and building trust through those small, consistent moments of connection, that's what really makes a difference.
Yes. And Brown talks about some of the personal changes she experienced as she started to consciously embrace vulnerability.
Like what?
She became more comfortable with storytelling. She learned to set boundaries and say no when she needed to. And she found that those no's actually led to less regret in the long run.
Less regret, not more. That's interesting.
It is. And she connects us back to Theodore Roosevelt's famous Man in the Arena speech.
What's the connection there?
Well, she realized that the opinions of those who are on the sidelines, the critics who aren't actively engaged in the struggle, are far less important than the support of those who are in the arena with you.
The people who are in the trenches with you.
Exactly. And she decided to focus on creating a home environment where everyone felt safe enough to be both their bravest and their most fearful selves.
A place where vulnerability was welcomed and supported.
Yes. And she learned that asking for support, that first dare to reach out, is often the biggest hurdle we face.
That first step is often the hardest. Now, all of this leads to the really important concept of shame resilience. Brown tells a story about a man at one of her talks on wholehearted families.
The one who didn't even want to be there.
Yes, his wife basically dragged him along. But afterwards, he approached Brown and asked this really insightful question. Is getting past shame necessary for getting to vulnerability?
And the answer, of course, is yes.
Absolutely. You can't really have one without the other.
Right. Shame resilience is essential for embracing vulnerability. We can't let ourselves be seen if we're terrified of what people might think.
And she makes a really interesting point about this. When we say we're not good at vulnerability, what we often mean is that we're damn good at shame.
Exactly. And she uses a great Harry Potter analogy here, quoting Sirius Black. We've all got both light and dark inside us. It's the part we choose to act on. That's who we really are.
Love that quote.
It's so good. And it really gets at the heart of it. We all experience shame. It's a universal human emotion.
But it's what we do with that shame that matters.
Exactly. If we don't acknowledge and address our shame, those feelings of inadequacy, we start to believe there's something wrong with us. And those beliefs can really sabotage our ability to connect with others and engage in our lives. So developing shame resilience is crucial.
It's like our defense against the dark arts. Now, shame can have a particularly damaging effect on creativity, right?
It can. First, it can lead to us holding back our creative work because we're afraid of judgment. Second, if we do share our work and the reception isn't what we hoped for, it can be really devastating.
Like a punch to the gut.
Exactly. It triggers all those feelings of inadequacy. And even if our work is successful, if we tie our self-worth to it, it can create this never-ending cycle of trying to please, perform, and perfect.
Always chasing that external validation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if we cultivate shame awareness and resilience, we can start to separate our worth from the outcome of our work.
We can take risks and be more open to feedback without feeling personally attacked.
Yes. Now, Brown uses this metaphor of the gremlins or shame tapes. What do you think she means by that?
Well, I think she's talking about those negative voices in our heads, the ones that tell us we're not good enough, that we're going to fail.
Exactly. Those messages of self-doubt and criticism. And she shares a personal example of experiencing writer's block and all the shaming messages that came up for her.
Like fearing her work wasn't good enough, worrying about criticism, feeling like a fraud.
It's something so many of us experience, no matter what our arena is. And these shame tapes, they often come from old recordings, things we were told as kids or absorbed from our culture.
Not just specific criticisms we've received, but these deeper, more ingrained messages.
Exactly. And Brown quotes her friend Robert Hilliker, who said, "Shame started as a two-person experience, but as I got older, I learned how to do shame all by myself." Sometimes our own inner critic is the harshest one we face. And the power of shame often comes from the fact that it feels so unspeakable.
Like, we can't even talk about it.
Exactly. It thrives in secrecy and silence. Now, it's really important to make a distinction between shame and guilt. What do you see as the key difference?
Well, shame is about feeling like I am bad, like there's something inherently wrong with me. Guilt, on the other hand, is more about feeling like I did something bad. It's focused on a specific action, not my whole self.
Exactly. Brown gives the example of forgetting to bring a friend's lunch. If your thought is, I'm such an idiot, I'm a terrible friend, that's shame. But if it's, I can't believe I did that, that was really inconsiderate, that's guilt.
So the focus is different.
It is. And these two emotions often lead to different behaviors. Shame often leads to self-protection. Blaming, rationalizing, insincere apologies, hiding. Guilt, on the other hand, can motivate us to apologize sincerely, make amends, and change our behavior.
Shame can also be really destructive.
It can. Now, Brown admits that she didn't really understand how men experience shame until she was directly asked about it.
That's interesting. What are some of the key things she learned?
Well, she discovered this immense cultural pressure on men to not be weak.
It's like this unspoken rule.
Exactly. It creates this man box, this set of expectations that dictates what men can and can't do, how they can and can't be.
She tells a really powerful story about a college student who physically demonstrated what it felt like to be trapped in this box.
Yes. He crouched down, contorted himself, and said, imagine living like this every day. It was such a powerful image of how those rigid expectations can be so suffocating.
And it often leads men to hide their vulnerabilities, even from the women in their life.
It does. And Brown had this moment of self-awareness where she realized, holy crap, I am the patriarchy. She realized that even women can sometimes send mixed messages, wanting men to be vulnerable, but then reacting in ways that make it unsafe for them to do so.
It's a complex dynamic. Now, shame can also create real problems in intimate relationships. Brown calls them shame storms.
Yes, these emotional storms often happen around issues like sex, body image, aging, money, parenting, exhaustion. And navigating these issues requires honest, vulnerable conversations.
There's no intimacy without vulnerability.
Exactly. And Brown points out that perpetrating shame on someone else, especially someone you love, can be incredibly painful.
Especially when it's someone who knows your vulnerabilities.
Yes. To shame a loved one around their vulnerability is a real breach of trust. It's using their most tender parts against them.
Now, to protect ourselves from these vulnerabilities and potential shame, we all develop different forms of armor and wear different masks.
We do. These are the strategies we use to minimize our discomfort and pain. And while the specific ways we do this can be very personal, Brown found that we actually share a small set of common protection mechanisms.
So our individual armor might look different, but the underlying strategies are often similar.
Exactly, and she cautions against simply labeling others based on these defenses.
Instead, we should focus on understanding our own defenses.
Yes. What do we do to avoid feeling vulnerable? What are our masks? And what would it take for us to feel safe enough to take them off?
That's a really powerful question. Understanding what makes us feel safe is key to cultivating vulnerability.
Absolutely. And one of the most empowering parts of Brown's research was discovering strategies that help people put down their armor and take off their masks. She identifies three major categories of defense that are pretty universal. The first one is foreboding joy.
What's that?
It's that tendency to mentally rehearse tragedy when we're experiencing joy.
Like we're afraid to be happy because we're convinced something bad is going to happen.
Exactly. And the problem with this is that it prevents us from fully experiencing those joyful moments.
We can't be present in the joy if we're already anticipating the pain.
Exactly. The second major defense mechanism is perfectionism. And Brown defines perfectionism as something much deeper than just striving for excellence.
How so?
Well, she sees it as a belief system, a way of thinking. It's this idea that if I can just be perfect, I can avoid shame, judgment, and blame.
So it's about avoiding pain, not achieving excellence.
Exactly. And the ironic thing is that this pursuit of perfection often leads to more shame and inadequacy because we inevitably fall short. She quotes her friend Nick, who described art as this tattered box for all things imperfect and human. Perfectionism, Brown argues, actually crushes creativity.
The third major defense mechanism is numbing, and this feels especially relevant in our modern world.
It does. Numbing behaviors are those things we do to try and escape the pain of feeling inadequate, anxious, or disconnected.
It's like we're trying to numb ourselves to those difficult feelings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to distinguish between genuine pleasure, which is nourishing, and numbing, which is ultimately diminishing.
And anxiety seems to play a big role in our numbing behaviors. Brown gives the examples of constantly checking email and being glued to our phones.
Yes, some people, she calls them Group A, use constant engagement as a way to manage their anxiety. But it doesn't really address the root of the problem. Group B, on the other hand, focuses on aligning their lives with their values and setting boundaries.
And Brown makes this powerful connection between setting boundaries and believing in our worthiness.
Absolutely. We have to believe we are worthy of rest, worthy of saying no, in order to actually set those boundaries. And setting boundaries can be tough because those shame gremlins often pop up and tell us we're being selfish.
Or that we're not doing enough.
Exactly. And when shame is running the show, daring greatly, embracing vulnerability becomes almost impossible.
It also makes it really hard to deal with feelings of disconnection.
It does. Connection is about feeling seen, heard, and valued. Belonging, on the other hand, is about fitting in while still being yourself. And Brown found that the biggest difference between people who experience deep love and belonging and those who struggle for it is their belief in their worthiness.
Their belief in their own inherent value.
Exactly. And Brown shares that she used to try to make her uncomfortable feelings just go away. But then she shifted her focus to trying to understand where those feelings were coming from.
To get to the root of the problem.
Yes. And she realized that those feelings were often signals, indicators of a lack of connection or an attempt to avoid vulnerability.
So in addition to those three major defense mechanisms, she also talks about some less common ones, which she calls subcategories of shielding.
Right. One of these is the victim and Viking mentality.
What's that all about?
It's this belief that everyone falls into one of two groups: victims who are constantly being taken advantage of, or Vikings who are always in control and dominate others.
It's a pretty black and white way of seeing things.
It is. And Brown challenges this by asking how we define success within this framework.
It's a system based on fear and a denial of vulnerability. Another defense mechanism is floodlighting.
Yes, floodlighting is oversharing personal information, either very early in a relationship or with a large audience.
Like using vulnerability as a weapon or a way to manipulate connection.
It can be. And while the intentions might not always be bad, it often leads to the opposite of what the person is hoping for.
It pushes people away instead of bringing them closer.
Exactly. And Brown gives us a checklist of questions to ask ourselves before we share something publicly. Why am I sharing this? What outcome am I hoping for? What are my boundaries? Is this sharing reciprocal?
Those are really important questions to consider. And the final defense mechanism is serpentining. That's such a great visual. I remember that scene from The In-Laws.
It's perfect, right? The serpentining is all about expending a ton of energy trying to dodge a moment of vulnerability.
When just facing it head on would be so much easier.
It would. It's about trying to control the situation, back out, pretend it's not happening, act like you don't care. And it often leads to hiding, avoidance, procrastination, blaming, and even lying.
Sounds exhausting.
It is. Brown admits that she herself is a serpentiner. So once we start to recognize these defense mechanisms, how do we move towards a healthier way of engaging with vulnerability?
That's where shame resilience comes in, right?
Yes. Shame resilience is the ability to recognize shame and move through it in a way that maintains our worthiness and fosters connection.
And she outlines 4 key steps to developing shame resilience.
The first is recognizing shame and understanding our triggers. The second is practicing critical awareness about shame's messages. The third is reaching out and sharing our stories with safe people. And the fourth is speaking shame out loud.
Bringing it into the light.
Exactly. And when we stop caring about what everyone thinks, we actually create more space for genuine connection with those who matter.
And she gives us some strategies for reality-checking criticism.
She does. Questions like, whose opinions really matter? Are these people in the arena with me? What are their intentions? Are they coming from a place of love and support? Have I shared my work with people I trust and gotten their feedback?
So we can filter out the noise and focus on what's truly valuable. Now, this whole idea of cultivating vulnerability, it's not just a personal thing, is it? It also applies to the cultures we create in our workplaces and schools.
Absolutely. Culture plays a huge role in either fostering or stifling vulnerability. And it's not just about strategy, it's about values. Brown asked these key questions for assessing a culture. Is there trust and psychological safety? Do people feel comfortable being themselves? Is there a willingness to ask for help? Are mistakes seen as learning opportunities? Is feedback given and received openly? Or is comfort prioritized over growth and feedback?
Those are really telling questions.
They are. And the answers can reveal a lot about the level of connection, disengagement, and the struggle for worthiness within a culture. She even brings in an analogy from Sir Ken Robinson, who said that human organizations are networks of people with feelings and values, not machines.
We're humans, not robots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Rehumanizing our workplaces and schools requires courageous leadership. And she shares some really powerful stories of people who love shaming work environments. It highlights the very real impact that culture can have on our